Hi, my name is Chad Briggs from the University of Alaska Anchorage. I'm very honored today to be able to talk to Dr. Jeremiah Asaka from Sam Houston State University. Dr. Asaka, could you please introduce yourself?
Well, thank you so much, Chad. Like you said, I'm Jeremiah Asaka. I'm an assistant professor of security studies at Sam Houston State University in Texas, Huntsville, Texas, for those who know Texas. Yeah, and I'm happy to join you today. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I was really interested in your background. You started with a degree in environmental science in Kenya and then found your way to Ohio, Boston, and now Texas. So could you describe a bit what got you into environmental security? Like who and what were your influences in studying?
Yes, so thanks for that. My journey has been very interesting. I started out as an environmental scientist in Kenya and actually ended up working as an environmental assessor and did some work there, moved across the country. And when I came to Ohio to do my master's, I went in to do issues to do with climate change adaptation among pastoralist groups that are living with wildlife. Mm-hmm. I will just say something little about that. Growing up in rural Kenya, I grew up in a time when our country or Kenya only had one TV station called the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, KBC. And so in KBC, you didn't have a lot of programs, but one of the programs that I really enjoyed was this, I don't know whether you know Sir David Attenborough, BBC Wildlife.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so there was this, The Living Planet, and all these other documentaries that he used to show. And so I really got attracted into wildlife and things like that. But the issue with Attenborough's documentary that I never got to realize at that time when I was little is that it paints a picture of a world teeming with wildlife but devoid of people. So it would show everywhere, including Serengeti, Masai Mara. So when I got to high school, I joined Wildlife Club as usual. And so, so we organized a trip to Masai Mara. And then I got there and I realized that there are people actually living with wildlife here, the Maasais. But what shocked me the most was that the poverty there was very, very high, when wildlife was a big contributor to Kenya's economy and has always been, even though now, because of COVID-19, I believe tourism has gone down. Most of the revenue comes from wildlife tourism. And so that got me thinking that there must be something really wrong here. There must be a disconnect between these two. So I still continued liking wildlife and stuff. I went on to do environmental science at the university, which was essentially, I would call it environmental studies as well, because there was a bit of science, hard science lab, and there was also the social bit of it. And when I graduated, I got a job, and this job at one point took me back to these places. So now the northern part of the country. The other was the southern part where you have the Maasais. Now this was the northern part where you have the cousins of the Maasais called the Samburu. And so up here, my work was to audit tourist lodges, so do environmental audit of tourist lodges for a chain of tourism industry players. And so I was hosted in very nice tourist lodges and stuff, and I was flown around, moving from one place to this private little, the 4-seater, 6-seater kind of Cessna planes. And while I was at these places, I could see how the Samburu's story is not very different from the Maasai's. So you could see all this nice life at the lodge, but then the people serving you and the community around are not really doing well. And so that really informed how I started shifting my study from the hardcore science to the social science. So when I got to Ohio University, I reached out to, before I got in, I reached out to some of the people who were doing work there. So Dr. Tom Smarker has been working on climate change adaptation and climate change issues on that region in Tanzania and Kenya. I reached out to him and Dr. Edna Wangui, and we started something. And Dr. Tom Smarker ended up being my master's thesis advisor. But along the line, somebody came in the picture as I just got admitted. So when I got admitted, the program director was leaving and a new one was coming in. And so the new one happened to be Jeff DeBelco, whom you know.
Yes.
And so, for lack of a better word, I would say we kind of got this love at first sight kind of thing. We struck, I don't know how to say it, but we became very good buddies. And up to now, maybe one day I'll ask him what he saw in me, but that really changed things. So the way it changed things was at that time, the Belco was working on, so the IPCC, I think it was the fifth review report, yes, fifth assessment report. And they were working on chapter 12 that was dealing with human security. And so I was this graduate student at that time working as this research assistant. And so I used to help with a few things here and there and got to start reading things, learn about people like Richard Matthews, Adgar and Simon Dalby and all these guys. And my interest started ticking, and I started asking myself, this concept of human security looks very interesting. Because environmental security at the time was, to me, very state-centric. So it wasn't very appealing. I didn't see how it was going to connect with this guys. So I started thinking how I can connect human security with the things that I'm already doing, climate change and stuff. And so that's how the thing started. And lo and behold, when it got to time for me to apply for PhD programs, I saw this PhD at UMass that was global governance and human security. I said, wow. And so I applied, and luckily I got admitted actually even before, I got full funding and everything before I even defended my master's thesis. And it was very impressive. I was like, wow. Yeah, so, and that's how now I got into the environmental security issues, mixing my environment side with human security. So my understanding of environmental security is actually from a very people-centered understanding of security. So it's slightly different from the traditional one where we started with the state being the main thing, which focused on scarcity and violence, and yeah. So it's a little different. So in a nutshell, that's really it. I don't know if I missed something. Maybe you said who influenced me, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, so the influences have been varied at different stages. The one that actually pushed me towards security, of course, is Jeff DeBelco. And then I've had influences over time with others. So now like scholars from the African side of the divide. So the one that comes to mind in this context mainly is Cyril Obi. And Cyril Obi is, I would recommend his works because he kind of gives a very different perspective of all these environmental security issues. Yeah, and also I've had a bit of influence from gender scholars like Jane Pappert and Dr. Edna Wangui that I mentioned earlier was also a gender scholar. So some of my work, you see, I kind of bring in a gender-based analysis as well. Yeah, but by and large, I'm very interdisciplinary, and I've had an array of influences. And the other part that I got influenced later on towards the end of my PhD was when I got, which I know we'll talk about later, but the issue of the nexus. Stacy Van de Veer at UMass Boston was very central in bringing me in that fold, and yeah. So in brief, yes.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you about the nexus. So this, you're right about the water energy food nexus. And so for people who aren't familiar with it, like how would you describe that concept and how it applies to security in your work?
So the nexus, the way I see the nexus, or the way I would want people to see the nexus, is starting from the simplistic understanding of it as a connection between things. But so now the nexus from what we're talking about now is, I see it as a growing area of research that's concerned with looking at, I would call it the resource nexus actually, that's concerned with looking at the interlinkage between separate, or what I would call disparate but linked factors like water. So resources, basically water, energy, food. In my work, I include land, and I know there are others who've gone further, including minerals, like Stacy, they include minerals. And yeah, so the most popular one is a 3-node nexus of water, energy, and food. But I think more nuanced understanding includes more than just those three. And the Nexus research gains a lot from looking at putting scale into perspective and then context. So it varies. If you're to study Nexus in water energy food nexus in Texas, and you want to study water energy food nexus in maybe Massachusetts, you'd find very different things. So it's good to look at the context. And also, if you look at the nexus at a global scale, and then the nexus at a local scale, then also you need to tweak your framing a little bit, because there'll be variations. Yes, so, but by and large, the resource nexus is this growing area of research that's concerned with looking at the interlinkages between these rather separate but connected factors or resources to inform policy and better practice.
Well, right, because you've written about places like Northwest Kenya, where you have a combination of both scarcities and abundance at the same time. That maybe land is scarce, but there are new oil deposits, and yeah, it's not just a simple, oh, here's one scarcity, and so that makes it a conflict area, right?
Yes, I can say a little bit about that. So like the area I've written about, I've worked on more is northwestern Kenya that you talk about. And I try to complicate the nexus a bit by adding climate change and then security into the mix. So I look at the interplay between the resource nexus. So the work that I believe you're talking about the latest one, the book chapter, though I wrote, I've written 2 others, I believe, but the one that is on water, energy, food, nexus, and human security and climate change, I'm looking at 3 nodes, and I'm looking at the interplay between those 3 nodes, climate change and human security. So how those 3 interact. And I also bring in the issues of governance. And it helps you have a clear understanding of what's going on there, because if you just look at, for example, if you're going to study water security in that place, you will miss out on a lot of things. And if you're to base a policy intervention on your findings, you might end up with a situation where some of your interventions lead to problems with maybe other resources. So maybe like food, you might devote more land to water and vice versa, affecting this other one. So even energy, you might do, so like one of the cases I bring out there is of Turkana. Turkana County is one of the 47 counties in Kenya. And in that region, it borders Uganda, it borders South Sudan, and it borders Ethiopia in different areas. And there was a oil discovery there recently. And also before that, there was a big water reservoir discovered there. And also, the issues with the the damming of the river Omo from the Ethiopian side. So if you don't look at it in all that perspective and just look at energy, then you miss out on a lot of things. So the Nexus helps you understand all these things so that when you intervene, you don't create more problems than you're actually trying to solve. Yes.
Yeah, it's often easy to stereotype and make things simplistic, especially from a distance, I think.
Yes.
I mean, like you said, even Texas politics is going to be very different than Massachusetts politics.
Very different, yeah.
So let me ask you about some of the early influences, not necessarily on you, but on the field. So I often have my students read literature from the 1990s, like Homer Dixon, Robert Kaplan, Connolly and Kennedy. And I do that partly because it influenced what came later and influenced policy a lot. And some of the images haven't gone away. Like some of these portrayals that they have of Africa as being this kind of dark, chaotic place where there's all this violence and it just spills over into the calm, ordered Europe or North America. So could I just have you maybe give some reactions to, what someone from that area thinks of how, Westerners have often portrayed Africa?
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't know how to put this, but yes, I think they will not be very pleased.
They're not friends of mine. It's okay, man.
Yeah. So I'll say what I think about the resource scarcity thesis. It's very popular. That one I have to admit, and it's popular for a reason, because of, I think, how the scientific world is framed. It's largely European, North American centered. So it makes such kind of analysis pick very quickly. And most of the time, it goes without saying that opposing voices or alternative voices are not always given the chance. And before I go further, I think I would also recommend the work of Cyril Obi here. Yeah, but the way I see the resource scarcity thesis is that it's a little simplistic and, like I said, very European, North American centric. Because the gist of the argument in this thing, if I get it right, is that population growth leads to resource scarcity, which translate to conflict, if I can simplify it like that. So there are three problems I see with that. I know people have criticized this a lot, but from my own perspective, there are three things I see here. One is that most of this work was just focused on the developing world. And that alone makes it very problematic because it paints this picture, like I think you had alluded to it, of people cannot really cooperate over resources and only opt to fight. So more like savages fighting. And so that is, and this is across board, how they do this in all developing, I think even East Europe, like the Balkans and all those areas, the framing is all the same. And I think I have a problem with that because cooperation is a very central part of this. And there's a lot of work going on in this, including the early work done by Elina Ostrom on the commons, which actually shows how people can be very innovative in running these things, and tragedy in commons is not always a given. So I find this very, for lack of a better word, very simplistic and maybe deterministic, if I can say that. And the other problem I have with it, so that was the focus and the idea that people are just given to conflict. Conflict might be there, but we need to know the root causes of the conflict. They're not just scarcity related for the most part. There are a lot of structural issues and stuff. And I think the other people that I believe will not agree with this notion are also people like Arun Agrawal. So this is from the Asian side. And even I believe Debelko and Aaron Wolf of Water Research. I think he's out of Washington, I believe. Washington. Yeah, so those are some of the people that I think their work, if you look at it, they will kind of challenge this notion that people always in these areas are always just given to fight over resources and they do not cooperate. Yeah. The other thing I have is the issue of population growth, which also I find simplistic, because population growth, there's no doubt if you are many than resources, you might overuse your resources and stuff like that if you can't come up with innovative ways of, or even techno fixes and stuff like that. But this point misses a lot of things, because it looks to me like, and I think it's informed by the old, now debunked ideology of, or theory of Malthus, which I think in that area, I don't really find it holding much water. Yes. So they connect it to this Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, where you have these farmers who everyone is acting on their own self-interest, and as their population, whatever increases, they end up using things up. And all this has been debunked, but this is still what the resource scarcity thesis is based on. So that I find it problematic on that. And lastly, which I bring in my human security perspective, is this overly focused on violent conflict. And I find this, I can trace this to the fact that most of these early works on environmental security were based on a national security understanding of environmental security, or of understanding security. Yeah, so conflict is not the only or the major threat to human life in some of these areas. So when you elevate conflict to a level where it looks like, think of it like what we do in the United States, terrorism. We elevate terrorism to a point where you think terrorism kills like millions of us all the time, when in reality, a lot of things like now COVID-19 is taking a lot of us now, more than 100,000, but you still find terrorism still being elevated to a level where it doesn't really, given more credit than I think it deserves. So those are my three critiques of it. I feel like they need to nuance it a little bit. It needs to be nuanced a little bit, and there's need to think of or be willing to understand that there could be other perspectives, and these issues can be very problematic, because the problem is that this people like Homer Dixon and so like Kaplan, their position in these societies make their ideas permeate into policy and practice. And because the North America, United States, and Europe and such like countries are essentially the one who are quote unquote running the globe, if I can say that, it means most of these ideas will actually find their way back into those places and create more problems. And they're actually, I believe, creating more problems than they're solving. But I think there's light at the end of the tunnel. Human security scholars are coming up, and other critical guys from the gender tradition are also coming up. And I think with time, this kind of simplistic diagnosis will be put in their rightful place, just like the Malthus one and the Tragedy of the Commons, which should now actually be somewhere in in the museum or something.
Yeah, and if I could emphasize another point that
Yeah.
I think you've also written about in terms of the historical context, that
Yes.
you can't look at a place like Africa without understanding the colonial background
Mm-hmm.
and how that set up political structures and economic structures.
Yeah.
And it's not just Africa. I mean, you couldn't understand what happens here in Alaska with resource use if you only look at Alaska, because there aren't that many people here. And actually, we get most of our resources from outside of Alaska. So
Mm-hmm.
we export all of these raw materials, and then we have to rely upon the lower 48 states to import all of our
Mm-hmm.
food and even fuel. Like there's very few fuel processing plants in Alaska. And the same is true in Northern Canada. You know, it's a very colonial relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was one thing that Simon Dalby really opened my eyes to when I was a student of his, right? This political economic impact of how things are set up, that it's not the local people who are often using the resources.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. Yeah, most of the conflict, actually, when you look at it keenly, and I'll talk about this as we continue to, but most of it. So I'm going to talk about a concept of manufactured scarcity, which I will say more later. Um, the scarcity is not really just from population growth. And most of these societies, they have adaptive strategies that they use. Like where I study in northwestern Kenya, population grows, but when you talk to these people, there's migration that never used to be a thing there. And there's also this mobility among themselves between these areas. All these strategies ensure that they don't overrun the resources they have. So problem comes in when policy changes or interventions informed by policies that are informed by this scarcity population growth understanding come in. So like in the 80s, and I think between 60s and 80s, you had this idea of tragedy of the commons taking root, and places like where I'm studying, there was a huge move towards sedentarizing mobile pastoralists. So you drill boreholes for them so that they can actually stay around those areas, and then try to introduce agriculture and stuff like that. And this led to a lot of problems, which are still being seen to this day, and more other things. There are new others that I'll talk about as we continue. Yeah.
Well, yeah, please do continue on that, because I wanted to ask you about, you know, what are the problems that people should look at in East Africa? You know, either if students are interested, or what do you think researchers need to focus more on?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'll start with I can frame them as pressing issues, but then this list I have here is not really exhaustive. I'll start with the elephant in the room, climate change, which I believe is one of the biggest issues there now. And some of these areas, like where I study, climate variability is a part of the life there. So you have all these changes in weather patterns and stuff, droughts becoming more frequent, prolonged droughts that used to come every 10 years that were very predictable now come almost every other 2 or 3 years. You have El Nino, which never used to be there. You have a lot of flash floods. So those kind of things might get worse as the climate changes. So climate change, I believe, is top on the list of this. And then I can talk about the manufactured resource scarcity I was talking about. This is something that I just, I came across when I was doing my field work. So there are several interventions being done from the global level. And they're mainly informed by this idea that, which is good, that we need to take care of the environment and all that. But most of these interventions go to places where the locals don't really have a say. So for example, there's a spread of community, what is called community-based conservation. It's varied across regions or geographies, but in the case of where I was studying, the model that's being rolled out there, it's more like the model of parks, where you have areas with no human activity, so you cannot access them. And you do this in community land. And in most instances, the places where they give to the wildlife are the places that have water, that are more green, technically places that pastoralists used to use as dry season grazing areas. So those areas, once they've been earmarked as what they call core conservation areas, the pastoralists can no longer access them. And most of this community conservation is based on this idea that wildlife conservation attracts tourism, which in turn brings money to the locals. But that has not been very forthcoming. And now with things like COVID-19, where there's no tourism, it's even worse because their livestock has dwindled. So the livelihood they used to depend on is already compromised. The new one that they were being promised is not delivering. so it's a really tough situation, but it's happening that way because there's very little consultation going on, or substantive consultation going on with the locals. There are a lot of intervening factors like elitism. So the local elites are okay with this European, North American centric way of thinking, but the locals who are actually living it do not get it, and it affects them. And so the other pressing issue that I see is, now I'm going to go broader. So this would be sharing of transboundary resources, especially water. So the big one is now the Nile River, and the Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia is building, which is now a hot topic. And yeah, that's one of the things that I think anybody focused in the Greater East Africa or Eastern Africa or East Africa and the Horn should pay keen attention to. Then over-reliance on a state-centric understanding of environmental security. Most of security issues in this region are not really, should not actually be state-based. They're what traditionally you call soft security issues. So when you go with a state-centric way of looking at things, you end up with militarizing issues that should generally not be militarized. And this has happened even in the conservation that I was talking about. You have a lot of militarization of the conservation up there that it's actually going against the main aim of doing the conservation. Yeah, so you end up making people even not want to see the wildlife that they've been living with for a long time, because now it's more of a problem than a good. So that I feel needs to change. And yeah, so those are some of the things, and maybe governance challenges, which is a big thing. Governance challenges, that's also, especially resource governance. Yeah, that's an overarching issue that I can say. And so what needs to be studied more, I would say the resource nexus in specific contexts and at multiple scales, and the interplay between climate change and the resource nexus and implications of the same for human security. I would want to see more focus on cooperation over shared resources than conflict over shared resources, because conflict has been elevated to a point where I feel it doesn't really deserve being there. Because it's more like this idea of studying the threat multiplier effect of climate change, or the link between climate change and security. we've studied it so much to a point where now we know almost everything about it. So we need to move on to the point of what do we do? So maybe if we look at how climate change adaptation can lead to conflict, and don't assume that climate change adaptations are just good throughout, then those are some of the areas maybe we can start going to. But other than that, I feel like conflict, now we need to focus more on cooperation, yeah, which is actually happening. Like when I was doing my fieldwork up there, these communities that are painted as very conflict prone and stuff like that. I attended a meeting of 3 communities. So the Samburu, actually I think there were more than 3. The Samburu, the Borana, the Somali, and the Rendile. These guys were meeting to chat a way of how they can share dry season grazing area. And this one doesn't really get much traction in the literature or even in the media. All we see is a conflict when it arises. Yeah, but there are these little ones that are happening. So if those ones can be highlighted more, I think it will create more good than we actually know. And the other one is implications of climate change adaptation strategies for livelihoods and therefore human security. I think I've hinted at this. And the last one, which I believe is at the center of what we would call strategic security or national security understanding, is environmental security aspects of terrorism. So e.g. implications of a changing climate on Al-Shabaab recruitment and terroristic activities in East Africa and the Horn. So those are kind of, this last bit is one of the areas that I'm currently trying to develop interest in. I'm actually working on a literature review piece that will hopefully be published soon. Yeah, so I submitted it. I have some reviews to act on and then resubmit it and hopefully to pass through. Yeah, but that's pretty much what I have for now, and I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it is. It's hard for people to know somewhere where to start, and so if they just move out from existing literature, sometimes that, as you say, that can be limiting because much of it's already been done, or it's focused on the wrong areas. Yeah, the link between climate change and terrorism is interesting. I worked a little bit on that. God, this was like 10 years ago, but it was really shocking, sort of what you suggested, that there was such a difference between the evidentiary standards for what constitutes a terrorist risk versus what constitutes a climate risk, and they just didn't match at all. But yeah, there are potential pathways there, I see. Well, no, please go ahead.
No, there, and some of the articles I reviewed, actually, some of them are your articles, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good luck in your work. I hope that we'll be able to talk again, and do stay healthy. This is a sort of troubling time for everyone. So, and not every morning you get the reminder of environmental impacts on our own security, right?
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you as well.
Okay, bye.